Okay, welcome again. Glad you're all here. I'm going to be very brief this morning with a few opening housekeeping items before I turn it over to our Research Integrity Co-Chair, Melody Herr, to introduce our guest speaker for today. As I said, my name is Christy Park. I'm joining today from Austin, Texas. And I know many of you are joining from other places and from the indigenous lands of Turtle Island. Austin is traditionally the home of the Tonkawa tribe before they were forcibly removed from this land. And I just want to invite everybody. We don't have time for formal introductions of everyone, but we'd love for you to introduce yourself in chat. And if you'd like to share where you're joining from and your own land acknowledgement there, we'd love for you to do that as well. Thanks for being here. A few housekeeping items. We have a large group, so as is usual with Zoom meetings, it's helpful if you keep your mic muted unless you're speaking. We do encourage interaction and asking questions today, either through chat or if you want to unmute your mic and ask or make a comment, please do so. But if you're not speaking, go ahead and keep it muted. We usually go over our community agreements, and I just want to point people to that in our agenda and community notes document. I'm going to put a link to that in chat here. We do at TDL strive to create spaces where people are free to communicate and collaborate and be free from all forms of harassment. And we want these spaces to be inclusive of all people. So we ask everyone here today, as you participate, to be considerate and respectful in speech and action, to attempt collaboration before conflict, to refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech, and to be mindful of your environment and your fellow participants. That agenda document that I put in chat includes a section for community note-taking. So if you would like to take notes in a way that's beneficial to everybody here, you can do that in the document towards the end of the agenda there. There's a section for that, and we'll hope you'll take advantage. A couple of TDL announcements before I hand it over to Melody. One is just a reminder that registration is open for the TDL's annual conference, the Texas Conference on Digital Libraries, which is coming up next month, May 23rd through 26th, and registration is open for that. It's very affordable and it's fully virtual, so we hope you'll all join us there. And just an announcement about something we're very pleased about, which is that last week we posted a position for our first ever diversity residency in digital libraries, which will be an opportunity for a professional from a minoritized community to work on digital library projects and build experience and expertise in digital libraries through working with the TDL consortium. We're really excited about that, and we have links to that posting in the agenda as well. And finally, a reminder that our next Research Integrity Working Group meeting will be Thursday, June 23rd. That's 2 months from today. We're meeting every other month at the same time. So June 23rd at 2 p.m., the same time. And at that meeting, we have a special guest, Michelle Leonard, who is the Assistant Director and Training Programs at the University of Florida. She'll be talking about teaching research integrity to undergraduate students. So we hope you'll mark your calendar for that and keep an eye out for announcements as they come through the TDL channels and other channels where we promote these meetings. So I think that's it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Research Integrity Working Group Co-Chair, Dr. Melody Herr, who is the director or the head of the Office of Scholarly Communications at the University of Arkansas Libraries. Melody, over to you.
Thank you, Christy. So I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker, Reid Boehm. She is the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Houston. She holds a PhD in information science from the University of Tennessee, and she was a postdoctoral fellow in data and software curation for sciences and social sciences at the University of Notre Dame. Today, she's going to talk to us about research integrity and the implications for research data management, drawing on context from her own experiences, policies, and different types of research and data practices. So take it away, Reid.
Well, thank you so much, Melody. And I'm really honored to be here and really thankful to TDL for inviting me. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Make sure I've got the right one. Okay, can everybody see?
Looks good.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so as Melody said, we're going to talk a lot about the different connections and challenges and some things about advocacy and what we can do to be advocates for researchers. And one of the things I'd like to really stress, because I know we're going to kind of just skim the top of the iceberg here when it comes to data and its relationship to research integrity. And I'm kind of going to take a certain perspective on this, which is the open science perspective, because there's many different aspects. And of course, security is going to come into play with this as well. But that's kind of like when you define your scope, that was where it landed. And I think you'll start to see why. So to give you a little bit of collaborating for, I'm trying to think of the right word, but collaborating ability. We have a Jamboard, and if you're not familiar with Jamboards, which I hadn't known about them until very recently, they're fun. And what you can do is there's a sticky note button, and you can drag that sticky note right in there, and then type any comments that you want on that. And so I believe that we have that in the chat as well, and it's also in the notes. And I also wanted to, I will probably, after we look at the questions for what we put on the board, I'll probably go over to the board so we can all see it while we're looking, if that makes sense. All right, so if you all are ready, if you've gone to the board, I'd like for us to go and test this out. And to ask you, what is your role at your institution? Or, just where are you right now, and what are you up to? And also a little bit, if you would describe about your familiarity with research data management. And I'm really excited about having a conversation today. And so welcome any sort of questions or ideas so that we can really start that dialogue as we're moving along. So I'm going to go over to the board now. And all right, it looks like we have a lot of people there. And you can also upload pictures too. So if you're more of a visual communicator and it would be helpful to upload a picture, you are more than welcome. Oh, it's really cool to see all the people here. So exciting to see my RDAP colleagues that came in, the Research Data Access and Preservation Association folks, and lots of scholarly communications and research data management. Oh, this is great. I'll wait just a couple more minutes here to let people. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and move to the slides again, but feel free to keep adding your sticky notes in and anything else you'd like to say in terms of introductions for yourself. And let's go back. Okay, and I do want to mention too, at any time, if you have any troubles with hearing me or have any needs in terms of visualizations, feel free to, raise your hand or stick it in the chat or anything that would be helpful, because I know that we all experience things differently, and I've been there myself. So please feel free to communicate that. So as I was mentioning earlier, we're going to talk about the intersection between research integrity and data. And in looking at some of the definitions of data integrity and scientific integrity, there's 4 words that really kind of stand out to me, which is this honesty, rigor, transparency, and respect. And I think one of the things that you'll see as we move forward is that transparency and rigor really help us get to the idea of honesty and respect. And so I think that that's something that we'll talk through today. And I hope that these examples will bring that to mind. And we're going to go actually back to the board for just a second. It's a little bit of switching back and forth right now at the beginning. But I'd love for you all to tell me a little bit about when you hear the term data integrity, what does this bring to mind for you? We'll go ahead and switch the frame here. So we'll go to the next one. Oh yeah, these are great. Trustworthiness. Validity, yeah. Standards, that's a really important point too, yeah. Yeah, that contextuality, that's such a big issue when you're working, because each of us, our research is so different. We use so many different formats, so many different perspectives. Documentation. Yeah. Checksums, yep. Oh, this is wonderful. Well, please feel free to keep putting your ideas up there, and I'm going to go ahead and move back to our slides. I really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts about this. Starting off with a little bit of a story. I was sifting through Retraction Watch when I was putting the presentation together, and I came across this one post from Kate Laskowski, and what she was saying was that she was indeed admitting that there was something wrong with her data for this paper, and that so she needed to retract it. And what she was saying really was that the raw data that she had from it, she didn't know how to get a clear understanding of what was wrong. And so in that case, she said, because I don't know, we're not going to let this be used. And so in a way, being able to tweet it out like this on social media, which of course is very different than we've experienced in previous decades, is that, you know, people are really able to speak about this and can openly say, hey, I made this mistake. And I think in some ways that really gives us an understanding that, you know, as researchers, as people who work with data, it's very easy to make mistakes. And it's also very hard to admit when you're wrong. And so this is something that we'll kind of start to talk about, because yes, there are lots of people who do bad things, you know, everywhere. But there's lots of researchers that want to do the right thing, but may not be able to show that unless there are some conditions in place. And so we'll start talking about the conditions, the challenges that go with that, and then the things that we can do to advocate for folks to be able to show their integrity and to engender that trust and credibility. So let's start with making connections. And I love this picture. I put this up. Noam Chomsky is a famous linguist and political activist. And this reminds me of home as a kid. And so that's why I put this up here. But you can really see the connection between data management and files. So in terms of data misconduct, there's 3 different kinds that are really spoken about frequently. And of course, there's major variations of this. Fabrication is really that altogether creation of things that only exist in the mind of the inventor. Plagiarism, which of course we all are familiar with that. And then falsification, which is really this willful distortion of data or results. And what they say is that it really exists on this continuum. So it's hard to really determine what is willful and what is carelessness. And so there's a question about like, well, is carelessness really willful, or is it just maybe a lack of understanding? It's hard to tell, you know. So this is just some consideration of our environment and how we think about falsification. And this is really fascinating to me, this prevalence. And they did this study in 2009, and it's a meta-analysis. And they looked at these different articles, these different researchers, and they asked them, you know, have you fabricated, falsified, or modified your results? Or are you practicing things that are sometimes questionable? And surprisingly enough, I questioned, how did they get people to tell the truth? But what they found was that almost 2% really do. And that's pretty incredible. And that 33% really admitted to these questionable practices. So that's huge. Another factor that comes into play with this is the rapid release of research. And this is something you see with, you know, promotion and tenure aspects, but really when COVID changed our world and changed what was happening with us in so many ways, there was really an explosion of open access for publications. They say this adoption of radically open things, but really at the same time, there wasn't a lot of data sharing that was going along with that, and for various reasons, which we can totally understand. But what this really does is when you have the publications open, but you don't have the adoption of these principles or practices for understanding how you do the research, a lot of things are then off limits to truly understanding the integrity of the research, which really feeds into a lot of things like fake news and, you know, scientific things that people are speaking about that come in these different areas. And then there's all of these questions. So this is the paper down below here. And I have a copy of the slides in a folder that we can share with folks later so that you all can go back and see these papers, but there was one little part on this and I found it really fascinating. Okay, so we talked about transparency a little bit, and there's this idea of transparency is something that comes up a lot, but understanding exactly what transparency is quite difficult. As we've said, it's really contextual, as you all pointed out in your sticky notes. This book, Rigor Mortis by Richard Harris, who's the science correspondent, I think he does the medical mainly on NPR. This book is fantastic. I've only read little bits and bites of it, but one of the things he really talks about is how reproducibility really is one of the key things to regaining trust and solving a lot of the, the issues that come into play with medical research. And so this is kind of, I wanted to make sure that I differentiate between the idea of reproducibility and replicability, because you may hear a lot about a replicability crisis. And that's something that we are dealing with in the medical realm, where you want to produce a consistent result from an independent experiment that asks the same question. So that's a little bit different than actually computing the analysis with the data, with the environment. So it's a little bit different. You're actually here, you're reproducing the steps. And so that's kind of where folks are really focusing their attention right now. And of course, I know those of you who are working in the data field will have heard about this. And that's part of the question is, how do we do this? So one of the things in terms of data integrity that we talk about is the different things about treating your data. So thinking about things like alterations and how they should not occur. And that was something that you all mentioned too in the sticky notes, was the idea that you're not updating records, that things don't change during transfer. And some of that is checksum. Some of that is that code that you're looking at the file level to verify that things have not changed. Also the idea of storage, this we'll talk about as we move forward. And then really with a lot of data, specifically the example that I've talked with folks about is genetic data, because of the, you change one letter and it changes the whole, body of what you're looking at. So maintaining this read-only copy so that when you're looking at it, nobody can alter that at all. And you can come back to it and say, this was where I started from. And so if you look at hard drives, I wanted to share this because of the reliability issue. And this is something that a lot of folks have used their hard drives, which I know I do too. And that over time, I think 20% actually fail after the first 4 years. So you've got about 80% of them that are still viable, but you can see it drops off quite a lot at the year 3. So, using hard drives, it's like you'll want to check them very often to make sure that things are reliable. And many of you have seen a data management or a cycle of data life cycle is the word I want to use. And for this, I wanted to show it as kind of a process or a flow of information, because both are valid, both are viable. And here what we're talking about is this one instance of the data management across one point in time, because after this, the data does take on a new life and it does go through a new cycle. But one of the things that I want to make sure that I share and kind of crystallize is these 3 major components of planning that really come from knowing what you're creating, how you're handling it throughout the course of the project, and then how you're maintaining access and quality for the length of the life of the data. So as we think about this and we think about data integrity, what I'd like to do is kind of talk about how we are using points in this process through management practices to really maintain this aspect of data integrity. So we could think about things like metadata. We could think about things like storage. We could think about file naming conventions and really what I'm hoping to kind of do is to dig a little bit deeper into data management and say, because these are really overarching things that are requested of us as, I say us, I've been talking to researchers for a long time, and we're all researchers in some way, shape, or form. But if I start going into researcher talk mode, this is what I mean is that I'd like to do kind of a scenario with you all. And then we'll go back to the boards and we'll say, okay, how do these different actions that we may be aware of, we may be practicing with researchers at our institutions, how do they relate to integrity? And so let me give you the scenario, and this has a lot of text on it, so I'm going to kind of explain it. So in this case, I'm a physics researcher and I have a couple NASA grants that I'm working on. And in my lab, I have a bunch of graduate students and they're running analyses on different components of the data that I've collected. And some of them are local instruments where there's readings coming very locally. There's also a ground station where we're getting data from Alaska. And we have different spaces for processing, and we are backing up things. And we have 3 terabytes of data from a previous project that we will eventually use in some of these future iterations. But this isn't an archival space right now on our main department server. This is kind of a scenario that folks might run into, that a researcher might be dealing with. And really, there's no right or wrong answer here. But what I'd like to do is start to think about what this researcher and his students might do to maintain their integrity. So I'm going to switch over to the board now and we can talk through some of this. All right. So I've got kind of 3 areas to think about. And so feel free to put your sticky notes of ideas into one of these 3 areas. And we'll can go ahead and start one here. That's my thought, is that they're going to need descriptive metadata when I share this out with other people. Yeah, the workflows. Exactly. Protocols, yeah, for collecting and recording. Yeah, that identification of what is going to be needed to be documented. That's a really important process. It's like planning to plan. Yeah, and I see the restriction of access so that you know who's doing what and they're the ones that have access to it. I like the instrument calibration. That's really exactly. And what was the calibration that they used? Do we know? Yeah. Yes. Contact your friendly neighborhood librarian or archivist. Yeah, preservation metadata. All right. And 2, if you all are, because I know we have very all of us have very different mindsets and we're coming from different worlds. So if you do have a question about some of these terms, feel free to bring these up either now or as we move forward, so we can really make sure that everybody is on the same page. And that, because I think that, you know, there is always we do speak a data management speak from time to time too. And there are things that are specifically for, that are more devoted to certain areas of maybe, you know, biomedical or STEM related research. There are some that are more social science, some that are humanities based, and all of these things really, there's all dealing with research integrity here. So that's important to note here. In terms of the physics, we're really honing in on this aspect of pipelines and the workflow that's happening, and very lots of automated analysis would be the right word to use, I think. All right. Yeah, don't just rely on your postdoc. Yeah. Oh, thank you all. This is really good, and feel free to keep putting stuff in here. My hope is that everybody can take this with them, make a copy and take with you, so that we have an understanding of what we talked about and what other folks said. So we talked a lot about what we could do. And now let's talk about challenges. And this is one of my favorite pictures as well, of Margaret Hamilton and at MIT, and her giant lists of code and software that she worked on and developed with her colleagues. And when we think about challenges of scale, like, aren't you glad we don't still use paper and still create the amount of data that we do? That just continues to amaze me. Let's see. So I do have another board question for you all, and I appreciate you switching back and forth with me. We'll do this one very quickly here and talk about, you know, based on what we've talked about so far, what kind of challenges do you see coming up for, you know, for this researcher in his lab, for maybe any of the challenges that you've witnessed in your work, whether it's with researchers, whether it's with thinking about how you're working with others within your library or your institution. Let's go ahead and go over there. Yeah. The resources thing is huge. That was on my mind too. That aspect of incentives. I've heard that turnover a lot is a huge thing. Yeah, the reward structure in academia. Yeah. The point about file naming conventions is I think really important. That I've talked with a lot of researchers that say, like, I wish I could find the data that I needed, but really I've got so many different things going on that I just can't find it. And so that really restricts them from sharing in a lot of ways. Data transfer. Yeah. Natural disasters, yeah. Like the one thing we always forget about is the things that we don't realize might happen. All right, I'm going to go back to the slides now, and feel free to keep putting stuff in there as well. Somebody mentioned the NIH, and so I'm gonna focus on that for a minute too. And the NIH policy on data management and sharing has been in the works for many, many years. And I know over the past 3 or 4 years, really, I've been hearing, well, no, it's been 5 now. They're any day now it's going to come out. And we finally heard, you know, about it, I think about a year into the pandemic that this is coming. And so January of 2023. And some of the these are some of the major things that are changing, things that are required, really being able to justify why you might not share. And so that really, you have to provide a lot of description of your data. And there may be times where you weren't sharing before, but you really don't have a justification for it. So now there's a lot more responsibility to do these things that you're that you may not have even had a plan for in the past. So these are some of the things that are coming up. One of the biggest things that we're experiencing right now at UH is we have a compliant repository, the awesome TDR repository with TDL. And but what we are struggling with is finding a home for very large files. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is just one example of some of the big challenges, and something I know that many of us are going to be dealing with very soon. Also, one thing that some of the literature talks about is this lack of clarity. And they mentioned self-regulation and self-correction. And I really wanted to kind of hone in on some of the work that a group of us have been doing through RDAP and through the Spark, the Spark agency, or I guess they would be, I'll call them an entity right now because I can't think of the right word. But really we were looking at an update of the data sharing for the different federal funding agencies. And we had a lot of trouble finding recommendations and guidance. We had a lot of requirements, but there's also a lot of broken links. There's a lot of things that used to be but are no longer valid. And so really trying to find the right place to look for things that really talk to researchers or talk to folks that are advocating about self-regulation, about how we correct things when they're not up to the standards of communication or the standards of documentation. This visual is really interesting because this is looking, of course, agency-wide. So not all of this is data management stuff, but you can kind of really, this is indicative of a website from a government agency. Granted, this is a time of great change. I don't even have to tell you all that this was a hard time for us in the world. And so there's a lot of added links, but the removed links are really coming in this one place. I can tell you right now that was climate change, that was earth sciences work, but a lot of that is research and a lot of that is data. So this is just really indicative of the kinds of changes that are happening within a 4-year span of time. And folks mentioned the issue of scale. And this is something that I was really exposed to, and I didn't understand the full veracity until I started working with somebody from HBC. And one of the things she brought up was this curse of dimensionality. And to kind of take this from a very, I guess, kind of outside of the realm of the work itself. But my understanding of this is that really the more complex things get, the more space you need. And so the data points get further and further and further apart. And so over time, everything just expands, kind of like the universe, I guess, when I think about that. And so this is something that data management planning is really important for, because if you don't understand the scale that you're going to create at the very beginning, you can't budget and you can't plan. I mean, you can a little bit, but you really are going to be in a world of hurt later on. So that's one of the things that really comes into play with scale, and something that we can prepare for. But then also, I really like this this infographic about what's going to happen in 2035, which is pretty close when you think about it. That's a little over 10 years from now. So at that point in time, if we follow, I believe it's Moore's law, we may all be subject to our robot overlords, but we'll cross that bridge later on. So as I was mentioning, our data repositories are really struggling to equip ourselves for the scale that's coming up. And it's something that, yes, it's in biomedical research, but it's in all of these areas. And I think what you'll start to see is that funding agencies across the board, more and more, this is going to come up as a requirement. And there's this big question about where do I share, and how do I share? And this is something that I talk with folks a lot about. Is first of all, we did a focus group about a year ago with researchers who use a lot of storage at our university, and a lot of times what they were saying is, I don't know where to go, and I didn't know we had support. And so in a lot of cases, they're also saying, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to share because I've got a lot of stuff. And, right now I could just kind of drop it in a place, but that doesn't seem right either, so it really is this understanding these different aspects of granularity, understanding, what's a usable format, this is what I use, but is this what a person in aeronautics going to use? I don't know. There's an aspect sometimes of where folks are going to need to integrate multiple data sets together. There's also, of course, generating that documentation. And in some cases, that may be machine readable documentation from instruments, but how that then gets relayed to somebody who's outside of your domain. So these are all things that are swirling around, in whether it's in their heads, whether it's in the atmosphere, whether it's in conversation with other folks, that we continue to talk through contextually. So then we'll move back into reproducibility, as we've been moving through this aspect of curation. And really, the big things here is this. Sorry about that. That's not something you all want to see. Let's see. So one of the biggest things here is to keep the software and to keep the parameters so that you have the environment with which you've created something. And this can be really difficult. And it's, it's easy to say, I'm going to keep the software, or I'm going to use a container and I'm going to containerize the environment that I use. And there's wonderful tools to do this. And folks have really developed some methods in the computer science world and the library information science world to do some of these things to preserve them. But what we have questions about now is, how do we preserve that? How do we put that into our repository? This is something that's, it is also swirling around with lots of questions. There may be folks that have really found some good methods. There was one where there was a development that we used at Notre Dame to really get software into a package into the repository. And that was really cool to see, but these things aren't widespread yet. And so this is something that's always a, kind of a question, is people are doing things in these different places, but how do we communicate this across our communities to make this a reality, I guess would be the right way to say that. Which I think will be a good segue into advocacy here. And I want to keep track of time. It looks like we have about 15 minutes, and I think that will be good to kind of continue our conversation here as we get to the end. Let's see. So this person, Leanne Russell, I chose her. She worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is very close to my hometown in Knoxville, Tennessee. But she is really notorious for her work with genetics, and developed some amazing, I guess it would probably be, she developed some amazing, what's the word, advancements so that we can detect, I think detect cancer earlier, aspects of radiation. But that work really helped a lot of people along the way. And they built a place, she and her husband did, and called it the Mouse House. And so I just thought that was a neat picture. So the question that I have for folks now, and this is a question that I think will come across as we go into this very more short portion of the talk today, is what does advocacy look like? This is something I think about a lot. I would like in my role to be an advocate for researchers. And I guess my question for you all is, what does it look like for you? Where do you see it happening, in the institution, in your library, in different places, and how have you experienced it in the past? So, feel free to answer any of those questions, a couple words, a sentence, whatever would be best for you. There we go. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that aspect of partnership, I think, is really one of the things that I continue to start to experience over time working with researchers. Yeah. Yeah, getting into the room. Yeah. Being an intermediary for folks with administration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Consistency. Yeah, I think sometimes, as information professionals, we do play a role in terms of translating or bringing people together a lot of times. Yeah. A lot of figuring out how to contextualize. Yeah. Oh, this is wonderful. Okay, feel free to keep adding on. And I'm going to go back. This is something I wanted to share, and I've shared this in a couple different places, but it's a model that kind of came to me fairly recently as I was thinking about kind of working with researchers and what's really I've seen happening in a lot of cases, and what I think is a really good opportunity for folks that are in, our data management practitioners or working with researchers in general, is that really, I call this stuck in the middle with you, because it really is this idea that we are in a position to have a two-way dialogue with folks in a way that is difficult in other scenarios. And while there are opportunities to do some of this back and forth conversation, at different times. This is, a grand generalization. As we've mentioned, there really is this sense that we can play a role as a facilitator of a lot of translation between this generalized view, which the federal funding agencies have to have because they are looking very much across a broad swath of different types of data, different types of work. The university, who's looking at a different point of view, but also a very general view of this is our world. These are the resources that we have. This is what we need from the researcher. And at this point, as a library practitioner, we don't really need anything from anybody except our job. That's an important part. But we don't need anything from these groups. What we are doing actually is kind of playing this role as a facilitator of conversations. And we have this expertise and data stewardship principles and best practices that we can continue to learn about. But if we were to stay up here in the general view, we wouldn't be able to be that sounding board that's needed of us. And so this is something that I try to talk about when I talk about integrity, is that we play a role in helping that researcher and working with that researcher to gain that those elements that are needed to ensure integrity. And that's not to say that they don't have that already in their specialized knowledge, but in our world, what we can do is contextualize it, and we can really ask those questions that get folks to say, oh, now I see why I need to do this. So that's kind of some of this model. So we have lots of campus partnerships. And I love this publication from OCLC about social interoperability. They've done workshops, and if you all have taken some of those workshops, I would love to hear about them. But this is something that's really been, my colleagues and I have been kind of internalizing as we work towards building greater partnerships. But this aspect of different folks who have very different understandings of research integrity, who have very different experiences with data, coming together and hearing all of this the sides of this really allows us to see what you might even call a complex problem. We just wanted to mention that. That's kind of, I think, a huge point of advocacy here. And also, one of the things that this is an article from 2014, and this article was great. It's in ACRL, and it was talking about a lot of the things that I was thinking about here. But what it really did, I think, was really drive home the point that data curation can be an upstream practice. So instead of, we think about data curation as something we do when a researcher comes and says, hey, I'm ready to deposit my data in the repository, and I need to make sure it's, in a format and with the documentation it needs. But really, that can be really difficult for a researcher at that point in time. And so establishing the relationships at the time of planning is something that's really helpful, as as much as we can as practitioners. And then, asking, what's your vision for post-project? What are your requirements for post-project? What does that mean in relationship to your data? And then, can we be there at different points, different phases of the research process? And that's not always feasible, but in terms of maintaining integrity, my thought, and I'd love to hear more folks talk about this too in the little time we have, is that metadata is kind of one of the most important factors involved in that, because it continues to communicate, but it also helps you find things. So that would be kind of my one of my take homes for today, is that awesome community initiatives, And Force 11 is a huge one right now. They're doing publishing and ethics group. And they actually just had a meeting today. I wasn't able to go, but they put out a lot of good work. And so this is our closing question is, what else can we do? And I'm going to go ahead and close with that. And I would love to hear folks, talk about this, ask questions, anything that would be helpful for you in these last couple minutes. And I really appreciate your time today and all the stickies. It was awesome.
Thank you so much, Reid. This was really wonderful, and I loved seeing all those stickies going up on the jam boards. We are right at the end of the hour, but we've got a couple of minutes left. If anybody wants to share a thought about the final question Reid asked, what more can libraries do? Or if you have questions for Reid, we will take those for the next couple of minutes as we wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. I would love to talk with anybody if they feel like sending an email.
Reid, I'm curious, with your experience with libraries and working in research data management through libraries, where you think the big areas of where are those things where libraries really need to be acting to support research data management and greater integrity?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that there's a lot of different things, but I think some of the big things are establishing greater relationships across campus. I think that's one of the major things. And with that, the repository and the aspects of because we have done a lot of work with the institutional data repository formats and how we've developed them. But then I think like getting greater development and in line with our institutions so that we really start to grow that from the needs of the researcher.
Yeah, that question of scaling is just a big one that I know we haven't cracked yet with the Texas Data Repository, and that we're talking about and working on, is how do you support those ever larger data sets effectively?
Oh yeah. There's been a lot of I've seen a lot of different conversations in a lot of different places, and some really interesting ways of working through some of that too across different libraries and different groups.
So that little chime on my computer tells me that we are right at the 3 p.m. mark. And I just want to, I don't see any additional questions, although there is some chatter in the chat, which I want to make sure everyone takes a look at. But we'll go ahead, and I just want to ask you all to join me in thanking Reid with reaction emojis or thank yous in chat, as you already have done, for this wonderful presentation today. We're so grateful that you were able to join us, and so happy that so many of you were able to attend and participate in this Research Integrity Working Group meeting. As a reminder, we have another meeting coming up in June, I believe June 23rd, and we have a special guest speaker for that. So stay tuned for more details about that. And a reminder too that we have been recording this meeting, so it'll be available to you if you'd like to access it later on. So thanks again. We'll wrap things up and wish you all a happy Thursday and a good week, and see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank y'all. Bye.